Hello friends, it's the Stitches. A little bit ago, I posted a poll in my community tab asking what accessory I should make for my next video. The choice was between a soft crown and a collar inspired by Elizabethan ruffs. The ruff won by a decent margin, so today we'll be making that. I'll be making a soft crown in a future video sometime in the near future as well, so if you were hoping to see that instead, it's coming eventually. As for today's video, let's talk about ruffs. When you hear the words Elizabethan ruff, you probably imagine something like this, which you may have seen someone wear during a Shakespeare reenactment or something similar at some point in your life. This particular accessory is what is called a theatrical ruff, and it is not anywhere near historically accurate, as you probably already suspected. They are heavily inspired by portraits from around the Elizabethan era though. The ruff used to be an incredibly popular item that was not specific to the Elizabethan era, but it did seem to reach its height of popularity during the Elizabethan era. It wasn't specific to any gender, but it was more popular among the higher classes than it was in the lower classes. If you were a royal or a noble during the era, you were definitely wearing one of these. As you can see in this particular portrait, the ruff did sometimes have this loopy structure to it. This was achieved by starching the fabric, very meticulous ironing, and then sometimes the pleats may have even been held in place with small pins. As you can probably imagine, this wasn't super accessible to anyone in the lower classes, and pretty much only nobles who had ample free time and servants to dress them and do their laundry could achieve this. However, most ruffs did look a bit more relaxed, like in these next portraits. Most people didn't actually have time and energy to create perfect loopy pleats like we typically associate with ruffs. But since Shakespearean plays continue to be immensely popular, and they typically portray incredibly rich subjects, the theatrical ruff is a modern take on the historical detail. It achieves the volume and structure of the ruffs worn by royals without needing starch, pressing, or pins, which is incredibly useful for stage productions. It's also incredibly useful for those of us fashion weirdos who want to wear something similar to the Elizabethan ruff, but have no desire to mess with starch. Which is why today I'm going to show you how to make a theatrical ruff out of cotton fabric. If, however, you clicked on this video hoping for something more historically inspired, I highly recommend checking out this blog post. I'll have links in the description along with an archived version of the PDF that's referenced in it because the link provided in the article doesn't currently work. That being said, let's move on to some actual sewing. A lot of theatrical ruffs are made with ribbon, but I prefer the look of actual fabric. Using ribbon saves you a lot of labor though, so if you want to make a ribbon ruff and you're using this as a tutorial, you can skip to this timestamp that's on the screen. Once again, I'm focusing on stash busting, so I'm using a couple different black cotton fabrics that I already had on hand. I have some cotton sateen that's left over from another project, and a small length of regular cotton that might be broadcloth, but I don't really remember. It was a remnant that I got super cheap, hence why I don't have much of it. I'm going to use my sateen for the neckband because it's a bit nicer against my skin. My neck measurement was a little under 12 inches because I have a tiny neck. So if you're recreating this on your own, be sure to take your own measurements or else this will probably turn out too small. I'm cutting a long strip of sateen that's 4 inches wide by about 14 inches long, 14 being my neck measurement plus ease, seam allowance, and a little bit of overlap for creating a closure in the back of the finished ruff. To be honest though, I was mostly eyeballing the extra length that I added. My cotton broadcloth needed a bit of a trim. Always remember to wash your fabrics before you use them because they tend to shrink the first time that they're washed. This cotton came out of the dryer with some fraying, so I trimmed off the loose yarns to make it easier to work with. My fabric was 9 inches wide total, so I cut it into 2 long strips that were 4.5 inches wide, which left me with 2 pieces that were 4.5 inches by 36 inches. Ideally, you would have more fabric than this, but I'm just working with what I have. The width of your long strips of fabric will determine how far your pleats will stick out on your finished ruff. If you want a really wide and dramatic ruff, cut the pieces wider. If you want a really subtle ruff, cut the pieces a little bit thinner. To make things easier for myself, I used my serger for all of my seams. First, I joined my 2 long strips to make 1 extra long strip. I also finished the short ends on my neckband. The long strip doesn't need to be finished on the short ends because the selvage is still intact and that doesn't fray. Then I folded my pieces in half, right sides together along the long edge and pressed them. Back at the serger, I overlocked the long edge only, leaving the short ends open, essentially making long tubes out of my fabric. But before we move on to the next step, this seems like a good place to stick a quick commercial break. And now we're back, so let's move on to the next step. Next, I used a bodkin to turn the tubes I just made right sides out. Then these pieces need to be thoroughly pressed until they're completely flat. While still at the iron, I turned the seam allowance, which was really just the width of the serging, on the ends of both of my fabric pieces to the inside of the tube, pressing it in place. This should be nice and crisp so that it can be stitched to create a perfectly finished end. You could easily top stitch the ends on a machine, but I want the stitching to be invisible, so I finished them by hand. To do this, I used a ladder stitch. It's kind of difficult to see this on camera, so there should be a diagram on the screen that explains what I'm doing. Essentially, you use the needle to take what my college professors described as a bite of fabric on one side of the seam, pull the needle through, and then take a bite of fabric on the other side of the seam and pull the needle through. I tried to show you what this looked like on the camera as well as I could, but black thread on black fabric is not the easiest to record, so again, the diagram. Now I'm left with the fabric equivalent of 2 pieces of double-sided ribbon, 1 short for the neckband and 1 long for a series of cartridge pleats. To create the pleats, the long strip of fabric is folded like an accordion. The widths of the folds should be the same as the width of the neckband. That way, when the pleats are finished, they can sit neatly on top of the band without any sort of overlap. To start this process, first I'm going to baste my pleats. This stitching is completely temporary, so it doesn't have to be particularly neat. Create a fold that is the width of the neckband, secure it in one corner with thread, make another fold, secure it. This should honestly be a fairly self-explanatory process. I'm not securing my pleats particularly tightly because I won't be stitching them down to the band tightly. Again, because I'm working with a limited amount of fabric and I do want to cover as much of the neckband as I can. At the end of this process, I'm left with a long accordion of fabric that is loosely held in place along one edge. To make this a little bit easier to manage, I did the same thing on the other edge of the same side of the accordion. Now I have a fairly stable bit of pleated fabric that is ready to be secured to the neckband. And I am once again cursed with the task of trying to convey what black stitches are supposed to look like on black fabric. To join these 2 pieces, I'm tacking the fold of a pleat to the edge of the neckband. To keep my finished project looking neat, I hid the thread inside the layers of the neckband by tucking the needle between the 2 layers of fabric right where the pleat I was working with is, and then drawing the needle out of the fabric where I was preparing to secure the next pleat. Using this method, I secured the pleats to the band a little over 1/4 inch apart. I also removed the basting as I went. This makes it easier to just stretch the pleats out a little bit further. So here's what that looks like once the first edge is finished. The pleats are tacked down all along the top edge of the neckband. The next step is obviously to secure the pleats along the bottom edge of the neckband. I just used the same method as before, tacking the pleats to the neckband and hiding the thread in between the pleats, also removing the basting once finished. At this point, the ruff is almost done. All I need to do is add some sort of closure to the back of the neck. I didn't have enough pleated fabric to stretch it all the way along the entirety of the neckband like most ruffs, but if you have more fabric, you can cover more of the band. To create a closure, you can use any method that works for you. I see ribbon ties most frequently, but you can use anything that's comfortable. I didn't have any ribbon personally, so instead I'm just going to use what's already in my stash. I thought about using buttons with elastic loops, but I figured hook and eyes would be easier to close behind my neck. Now my ruff is finished. It stands up on its own without needing starch, and it looks great with my darker outfits. I especially like it with this strapless gunny sax bodice. When wearing something strapless, the ruff adds a really nice detail at the neckline. Ruffs are also a really great addition to collarless dresses, serving as a collar itself. That's all for today's video. I hope this was a useful guide for anyone wanting something that resembles an Elizabethan ruff. But if you did want something more historical, I again recommend taking a look at the links in the description. Thanks to everyone who watched this video all the way through. I hope everyone has a good day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!